So when a country loses its comparative advantage of producing a good, its income is going to be higher from the goods it has a comparative advantage of producing. And it can consume goods from other countries that are relatively good at making those goods at a lower cost. So they can't produce that good as well. I mean, it becomes relatively more expensive if they want to produce it themselves. So that's why it's beneficial to trade with another nation. This suggests that countries shouldn't produce goods that they don't have a comparative advantage at. They should focus on what they're relatively good at and then trade with other countries. Then both can end up with more than they did if they didn't engage in trade. But often there's a lot of political pressure on governments, especially over the past 5 years, to preserve those older industries that have lost their comparative advantage. They used to be super good at producing things, but now firms in other countries are now becoming much, much better at producing. Sometimes it's even firms or industries that never had a comparative advantage in the first place. So the idea is that you have a small industry, you want it to grow in your nation, so you put tariffs on goods from other countries, like in that industry that they would produce, so they have less competition. So you can grow that industry into something more powerful. So they become more productive over time as they become better at producing these things. Those are the two main reasons we see for political pressure for governments to enact tariffs. So what we're going to do is use the idea of consumer and producer surplus and markets in equilibrium that we talked about before to look at what happens when we don't allow trade to happen, when we do allow trade to happen, like free trade, and when we allow trade to happen but do it with tariffs. So let's work through an example. We'll be looking at the market for ethanol in the United States under autarky. Remember, autarky means no trade whatsoever. So if you want ethanol in the United States in this case, you have to get it from an American producer. So American producers are less efficient than at producing ethanol in this example than other countries. So the equilibrium price is going to be $2, and the equilibrium quantity is going to be 6 billion gallons of ethanol that's being bought and sold in the United States. It's all being produced in the United States and consumed in the United States because there's zero international trade happening. So domestic producers, if their cost of production is less than $2 per gallon, they're going to end up with a producer surplus. Again, the difference between the price they receive and the marginal cost of production, the lowest possible cost they'd sell it at. So we get this nice producer surplus triangle right here between the supply curve and the price. Likewise, consumer surplus is up here, the difference between the marginal benefit to consumers from that unit, I guess that gallon of ethanol, and the price they're forced to pay. In this case, the market is in equilibrium. In this case, there's 6 billion gallons being sold at a price of $2 per gallon. Sorry, I've talked like literally all morning, so my throat feels like it's going to give out. But my voice sounds funny and starts cracking, that's why. So now let's suppose out of nowhere, maybe not out of nowhere, but at one point the US government says that they can open up imports and exports of ethanol. You can now trade on the international level, so we trade with other nations. So let's say the world price of ethanol is $1 per gallon. So it's half the price that it is in the US. Other producers are much more efficient at producing ethanol, so they can sell it at a lower price. What happens? America imports ethanol because it's cheaper. American consumers are going to benefit from this cheaper ethanol. They're going to be made better off because they don't have to spend as much money on it. And American ethanol producers are going to suffer because they're going to receive a lower price for the ethanol they're selling on the market. So we have some winners. A lot of winners, the American consumers, get a little bit of benefit. And the ethanol producers in the United States are going to suffer. There's going to be a large cost to them because it's a relative small number of people we're talking about. So if we want to look at whether free trade in this situation makes America better off overall, we can compare the economic surplus in the market with and without trade. In this case, we're talking about free trade, so there's no government restrictions in this case. Very rare in the real world, there's usually at least some restrictions. But again, assuming away part of reality so we can actually work this out. Well, it's a little bit different than the supply and demand that we're used to working with. So we've got the supply and demand, the US demand, and the US supply. So this is for American producers on the supply curve, and this is American consumers. Now the world price is $1, so whereas equilibrium in the United States was $2, equilibrium price in the world is $1. And because there's a lot more ethanol being produced in the world than in the US, we're saying that Americans increasing their demand for foreign produced ethanol isn't going to increase the price. It's not going to put upward pressure on that. Again, a little bit of an assumption just to make this easier. So we're going to have a line right here at the world price. We're not going to see supply demand curve shift in this case because we're now allowing outside producers to come in, and we're looking at just the American production with the supply curve and this American demand, U.S. consumers with the demand curve. So at this price of $1, that's what we're going to be paying. Because any U.S. producer that's selling at more than $1 isn't going to be able to sell it when you can get it for $1 from a foreign producer. So demand for the U.S. produced ethanol is going to fall from where the supply and demand curve cross down here to where the world price crosses the supply curve. So right there at that $1, any ethanol that's being made that costs less than $1 to make for the U.S. ethanol firms is going to be sold to U.S. consumers. Anything that costs above that, consumers aren't going to buy. Again, it's too expensive when they can just get it cheaper. Now, the total quantity consumed by U.S. consumers, so where that price crosses the demand curve, right there is going to be 9 billion in this case, whereas the number bought from the U.S. producers is only 3 billion. So the difference between what consumers demand, what they're going to buy, and what the U.S. producers are going to sell is going to be the imports. In this case, the difference between 9 billion and 3 billion is 6 billion. Just so happens that math works out. So yeah, all this is going to be imported from foreign countries. So we end up with an increase in the quantity of ethanol that's being consumed. Americans are now consuming more of it because it's relatively cheaper than it was before. It went from $2 to $1 per gallon. So before, if you had the consumer had a marginal benefit of say $1.50, that put them about there in the demand curve, below the equilibrium price. They're not getting enough value out of it to be willing to purchase it at the price of $2 from an American firm. Once we have these foreign firms offering it at $1, if the consumer's marginal benefit was $1.50, it now makes sense for them to buy at that price. They're willing to because they have some consumer surplus. So the producer surplus used to be B and E. Now B is captured by the consumers. Now consumers are being made better off because these transactions are occurring. But producers aren't receiving those, like the revenue from those transactions because they're going to foreign firms. So A and B are now consumer surplus, and C and D. Again, this is different from what we worked with before because we're looking at, again, U.S. supply, U.S. demand versus the world price. These two areas, the imports, C and D, are also captured by consumers. So before these transactions were not taking place, we were selling 6 billion right there. So with just these two, now we're selling out here at 9 billion. So these two triangles become consumer surplus. So now by allowing international trade, by allowing trade from other countries, we've increased the amount of consumer surplus possible. Again, and this also highlights how much producer surplus is lost, so how much worse the these American-owned firms are being made worse off. So this whole area of B, which is a pretty large area in this graph, is being lost to the producers. And they're now dealing with a lot of competition from outside the US. So we can see how consumer surplus increases substantially because we're allowing this international trade to occur. Does this make sense to you guys? I know this looks different than any supply and demand we've worked with so far. So I want to make sure that I'm not throwing you off by including this in here. Almost think of it as like a price ceiling, and the price ceiling being the price on the world market. But we have this additional transactions taking place, being filled in from international firms, so firms in other countries that are providing it. So overall, because we've added these triangles C and D, overall economic surplus rises. So we're making the economy better off because we're engaging in this international trade. And gains to consumers outweigh losses to producers. Now, firms that face competition from these imported goods coming in from other countries, obviously they're going to lose out when trade is allowed. That area B is a fairly large area of producer surplus that they no longer have. And the quantity being produced by American firms is going to decrease from 6 billion here, equilibrium with no trade, to 3 billion. So that's a pretty big drop. So you're really hurting the industry. Because we're hurting the industry, they're going to try to convince governments to restrict trade somehow so that they're able to still sell a bunch of, in this case, ethanol. Now, these firms appear to deserve sympathy, especially because there's a human cost to this. We have employees lose their jobs. Businesses failing, unemployment, these are very difficult things to deal with. Remember when we talked about innovation and the market process and we filter out failed alternatives? We got firms that aren't able to produce efficiently enough. They're not providing enough value. That's what we're seeing in this case. Only the value is not because, or the change isn't coming because consumers' needs are changing. It's coming because of competition from other countries who are having a greater comparative advantage versus the United States. So it looks different, and it looks, it feels different. It feels like something's going on there, like some sort of, like more negative competition is doing this. Which tends to be why so many people support these protectionist trade measures in order to prevent these firms from going under. Remember, that's the idea of creative destruction, that old industries, old things that aren't as valuable, that we aren't able to do at such a low cost, that don't provide consumers with enough value to meet their needs. We filter out these failed alternatives, and we use those resources for things that actually help consumers. So that's also what's going on here. So it can be a very difficult process as industries mature, and they start to get bloated, and they lose their comparative advantage with other countries, because you tend to see a lot of employees being involved in this. That's a lot of people to lose their jobs. And when we get done with this chapter towards the very end, we can talk about specific things you can do besides tariffs and quotas that can help those people that are losing their jobs, the industries that are suffering, without doing things that can be so costly to the economy. So tariffs, just to give you guys a definition, is a tax imposed by a government on imports. So anytime a good is made in another country and it comes in, before it's sold, government puts a tax on it. So it increases the cost. That helps make the American-made products that much more appealing because they can be produced at a higher cost. And then there's quotas and voluntary export restraints. So these are numerical limits imposed on the importation of goods into a country. So we say only 4,000 cars can come in here from Germany in a year. Voluntary export restraints are Example, basically, country voluntarily does a quota. They say we're only going to send out so many to the US to prevent the US or whatever country from enacting a quota or from imposing a tariff. So it's kind of like, you know, doing that ahead of time so you don't get punished worse. So let's look at what happens when we impose a tariff on a market that's, you know, in free trade. So we're using the same ethanol market from before. So we've got the US supply here and the US demand there. We have a world price of $1, and that's what's prevailing in the US right now. We're engaged in this international trade. The amount being produced by Americans or American firms is where that $1 crosses the US supply curve. So that's 3 billion gallons we're producing in the US. Because that's all that's able to be produced below at a marginal cost of $1 or less. Above that, firms aren't going to waste money when they can't get the money back for it. US consumers are going to demand 9 billion gallons of ethanol. Again, it's going to be where that world price crosses the demand curve. And the difference between what's produced in the US and what's purchased in the US is going to be imports. In this case, a large portion of the market is imports. So let's say we put a tariff, 50 cents a gallon on ethanol. So what that's going to do is shift up this price. So instead of being the world price of $1, it's the world price of $1 plus the 50-cent tariff. We now got this new line shifted up 50 cents. The 50 cents is the amount of the tariff. When we do that, firms will produce until the marginal cost equals the new price of $1.50. So where that crosses the supply curve, is right here, in this case, 4.5 million. And now consumers are only going to want to purchase where that price crosses their demand curve. So that's going to be 0.8, so 7.5 billion gallons. So we end up with greater production by US firms. They're increasing their amount of production because now the cost is higher. The price that consumers are paying is higher, so they can afford to produce at a higher cost, which is something they couldn't produce any of these units on that supply curve before at the $1 price. Because again, they're not making the money back for the cost that they have to withstand and produce it. Likewise, consumers are now producing less, going from 9 billion, 7.5 billion. Because it's now a higher price, fewer people are going to purchase ethanol in this market. So going back to our idea of consumer and producer surplus, A is going to be producer surplus again. The difference between the price and the supply curve. So this area down here is going to be producer surplus. This is now added back into producer surplus. So once they began trading, once we allowed trade from the world, producers lost a big portion of their producer surplus. Now, thanks to the tariff, they've been able to get some of it back. This rectangle right here, labeled T, is the government revenue from the tariff. So the price minus the quantity of the goods that are being imported into the country. So the producers, the firms are made better off relative to free trade. They capture some of this producer surplus. The government gets some tariffs. They get some revenue from there. And then these two triangles, C and D, these are your dead weight loss. You take trades that are not taking place. So once we enact a tariff,
Where would the consumer surplus be then?
In this case, consumer surplus, they don't have this label. It's going to be everything above this new price. So it'll be this area and this area.
Okay.
Let me see if I can draw that out so you have a picture of both of those things happening. So this is going to be the U.S. equilibrium. I'll put the price and quantity. Then we allow free trade. Okay. So there we go. The difference between the 9 and this 3 is going to be the imports into the country. Initially, this whole thing is producer surplus. Now just this is producer surplus. And this is consumer surplus. This is consumer surplus. These 4 areas are all consumer surplus. Now we put this tariff on. A 50-cent tariff brings us up to $1.50 is the price. World price plus the tariff on top of it. Now we've moved there to the U.S. production, and that moved to there for the total consumption. So now we have, first we had, I don't even know how to write this first. We had 6 billion imports. Next, after the tariff, we ended up with 3 billion imports. So we have increased production in the US from 3 to 4.5. We've decreased consumption overall by US consumers and decreasing imports. So now, these both are consumer surplus, these both are consumer surplus. This goes back to being producer surplus. This is the dead weight. Dead weight loss. That's the dead weight loss. And this area right here is the tariff. So we have consumer surplus increasing when we go down to this world price. And then we have consumer surplus decreasing a little bit from there, producer surplus increasing a little bit from there when we move up to this higher price with the tariff.
I'm not sure if I understand how there's a dead weight loss, like whenever it goes to 3.0 to 4.5. Like I can see the 9 to 7.5, but like, how is it like whenever it's increasing? I don't know if that makes sense.
It does make sense that you're having a question with that because I'm struggling to figure out how to explain this properly. I'll get you a better answer next time.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure this is it. That these transactions are taking place, but they're taking place at a higher cost. It's like these consumers are still paying, but they're paying more.
So it's still happening, just not like at the
Not as good as it could be, yeah, without that. That might just be a little, might just be caused by geometry. That's why both of those are dead weight loss instead of like more of it being over there, but that's a good question. I'm not 100% sure. And normally it's obvious, it's like those are transactions not taking place, boom, done. All right, we are 25 minutes in. All right, let's briefly talk about import quotas in the sugar market. Because once I get through that, my voice is going to give out today. Okay, so we'll just look at quotas, but how quotas and the voluntary version of quotas work are basically the same. So currently in the US, we have a sugar quota. So only 5.8 billion pounds of sugar can be imported into the country. Now, given our climate and our geography, the US isn't in a good position to grow sugar or to do it very cheaply. Other countries can do it at a much lower opportunity cost than us because they have much better natural resources that are suited to growing sugarcane, whereas we're not. So in the US, we tend to use more expensive measures. So you can use sugar cane to produce sugar, or you could use sugar beets. Sugar beets are more expensive, but you can grow those in the US as well. So what this quota actually does is keep the price of sugar much higher than it would be if we use the world market and just import it from other producers. So the world price of sugar is about 20 cents. In the US, it's about 33 cents. So sugar producers, they benefit substantially from this. They get a higher price by producing it domestically. But all the US consumers end up suffering from this. And as we'll talk about later, other industries end up suffering because of this. Oh God, those colors are terrible. Like I didn't even think this was going to be used. Okay. So if there were unlimited imports allowed, we'd be down here at the world price. This is the same sort of market as before, where we've got this demand curve for US consumers and the supply curve for US firms. Because we're just looking at US producers and US consumers right now. At this world price of 20 cents, so there's no sugar quotas, US firms produce 9.2 billion pounds of sugar. So they're producing a lot less sugar than currently. And their sugar consumption is 26.1 billion pounds. So we're consuming a lot of sugar. But most of the difference between 26.1 and 9.2, that's all imports. What we end up doing, we restrict imports to 6.9 billion pounds. So it'll be the difference between the supply and demand curve, wherever that is 6.9 billion. In this case, we were given the price already at 33 cents. So this higher price, what do we get? A lot more sugar production by US firms and a little bit less sugar production or consumption from US residents. And we end up with a lot less sugar being imported. So we end up with free trade. This A right here was consumer surplus. Now it's producer surplus. So that's, think about the area of this rectangle is how much worse off consumers are being made, how much firms are being made better off by doing this. Again, we also have these two deadweight losses. So consumers being made worse off, that's just what producers are capturing from this. Yeah, don't want to talk about that. Yeah. So this B area, this is the gain to the foreign producers that are able to sell in the United States. So before that was like a tariff that increased costs the government got from the taxes. In this case, the increased cost is due to the artificial restriction of supply. So whatever that supply is, in this case 6.9 billion, multiplied by the increase in price, is going to be what foreign producers that are able to sell in the US, that becomes their producer surplus. So those that are able to sell in the US from other countries do get made better off. But the areas C and D are representing deadweight losses of the transactions that aren't occurring. And of C is from foreign producers that aren't able to sell in the market. That's where that deadweight loss is coming from. Yeah, so we got foreign firms that are not able to sell in the market, and then we've got consumers that are unable to sell or unable to purchase, and are purchasing a lower quantity because of the higher price. So again, we have some winners. We've got US firms that sell at a higher price, those foreign firms that are able to sell at a higher price, that are like allowed under that quota. And then we end up with deadweight loss. So we end up with transactions not taking place that would have taken place. Okay, So a common argument in favor of these import restrictions, whether it's tariffs or quotas, is it saves domestic jobs. So economists estimate that without the sugar import restrictions, about 3,000 jobs in the US sugar industry would be lost. So we can work out how much it actually costs per job we're saving, whether this is actually worth it, or whether it's just a very small benefit we're getting. So the total cost of the sugar quotas from other countries end up costing the US about $3.26 billion per year. That's the current estimate, based off of the deadweight loss and the increased cost we're paying. So basically, if you divide that cost by the number of jobs, it's costing $1.1 million per job that we're saving. We've got a very large cost spread out across the country, across all sugar consumers, saving a very small number of jobs. But this is probably an underestimate. We're not taking everything into account. You guys remember Hershey? A couple of years ago, they shifted production to Mexico. And like people were very upset about it. Obviously, Hershey is like a historic thing because it's like the company town. Anyone been to Hershey? Yeah, it's a decent number of people. It was kind of like a big deal, Hershey leaving. Well, one of the reasons they left is that sugar is so much cheaper in other countries. So Mexico doesn't have the sugar quota that we have, and they're buying it at the world price of 20 cents. It's a lot cheaper to move production to Mexico and purchase the sugar in Mexico. So we end up losing jobs in other industries that are related to sugar because now it's more expensive to buy sugar in the US because of this quota. So while the primary effect may look like we're, yeah, go.
Where did the 3.26 billion come from?
This is the first time they mentioned on the slides.
Okay.
I'm sorry. In the text at the beginning, it mentions how much money we the sugar quotas cost us.
Okay.
We see the effect of these 3,000 jobs being saved, of protecting the sugar industry. But what we don't see is the other jobs that are related to sugar manufacturing that end up suffering because of this. So it's much harder to notice when Hershey leaves because of the increase in sugar prices. There are several other, textbook mentions 2 other companies that I haven't heard of that shifted production overseas because of the increased price of sugar. So we end up having these secondary effects. We're not just making consumers pay more, but we're also reducing jobs in other areas. So there's something to keep in mind. All right, and here's just several industries, the number of jobs saved. So in some of these cases, only saving a few jobs. Was it 216, 226, 390? So some of these industries, we're not saving a lot of jobs, but we're increasing costs so much that it costs a ton of money per job. So like luggage, it's almost 1.3 million per job saved. There's got to be a lot cheaper ways to do it than that. All right, so we'll look at the Smoot-Hawley tariff next class and finish up this chapter.